They say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes family can make you feel like you're drowning in it. What happened at my mother's 60th birthday party changed everything I thought I knew about where I stood in my own family. By the end of the night, I had gone from being the family disappointment to owning the ground they stood on. This is that story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The text came on a Tuesday morning, while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my corner office overlooking downtown Phoenix. Mom's 60th at Grandview Gardens this Saturday, 6 p.m. Wear something nice. Jessica. That was it. No. Hope you can make it, sis. No. We'd love to have you there. Just logistics from my older sister Jessica, delivered with the warmth of a parking ticket. I stared at the message for a full minute, my coffee growing cold as I processed what wasn't said as much as what was. Grandview Gardens. Of course, Jessica would choose the most expensive venue in Scottsdale, the kind of place where valet parking costs more than most people spend on groceries, where the waitstaff glides around in pressed white shirts serving tiny portions of food with names I couldn't pronounce, even after 4 years of high school French. I hadn't been home to Arizona in 8 months. The last time was for Dad's retirement party, where I'd spent most of the evening fielding questions about when I was going to settle down and give Mom grandchildren. Jessica had 3 kids by then. Emma, who was 7, little Marcus at 5, and baby Sophie, who was just learning to walk. Perfect Jessica with her perfect family, her perfect house in the perfect neighborhood, and her perfect ability to make me feel like I was still the screw-up younger sister who couldn't do anything right. Setting my phone aside, I turned back to my computer screen where the numbers told a different story. Revenue up 340% from last year. Client retention at 94%. My digital marketing agency, Phoenix Rising Media, had gone from a one-woman operation run out of my studio apartment to a company with 12 employees and offices in 3 states. We just landed a contract with a major retail chain that would double our revenue next quarter. But none of that mattered when I was home. There, I was still Rachel Thompson, the girl who dropped out of college twice, who moved to California with a boyfriend who turned out to be married, who came crawling back to Arizona with nothing but a used Honda and a maxed-out credit card. Never mind that I'd turned that disaster into the motivation to build something real. Never mind that I now employed people, owned property, had a waiting list of clients begging for my services. At family gatherings, I was just Rachel who plays around on computers. I picked up my phone and typed back, "I'll be there." The response came immediately. "Great, can you bring a side dish?" Nothing too fancy. Nothing too fancy. As if I might show up with caviar and champagne, trying to show off. As if I hadn't learned years ago that any display of success was met with eye rolls and comments about how I was putting on airs. I deleted 3 different responses before settling on "sure thing." The rest of the week passed in a blur of client calls, strategy meetings, and the kind of high-stakes problem-solving that had built my reputation in the industry. By Friday afternoon, I was wrapping up a video conference with a client in New York when my assistant, Maya, knocked on my door. "Your flight's at 8 a.m. tomorrow," she said, holding up the printed boarding pass. "Car service will pick you up at 6:30. And I ordered that fruit salad you requested. It'll be delivered to your hotel in the morning." Maya was 24, sharp as a tack, and had been with me for 2 years. She'd grown up in foster care, put herself through college, and had the kind of drive that reminded me of myself at that age. She also had no family drama to speak of, which meant she looked at my situation with the clarity of an outsider. "You know," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "you could always just not go." I laughed, but it came out hollow. "It's my mother's 60th birthday." "So? You sent a gorgeous bouquet of flowers. You're paying for the wine at dinner. You've done your filial duty." "It's not that simple." "Isn't it?" Maya leaned forward. "Rachel, you've built something incredible here. You employ people. You change lives. You just got featured in Forbes, for crying out loud. Why do you let them make you feel small?" It was a good question. One I'd been asking myself for years. The truth was complicated. Yes, my family had a talent for making me feel like I was still 17 and irresponsible. but they were also the people who'd been there when I'd hit rock bottom. Mom had let me move back into my childhood bedroom when I was 25 and broke. Dad had co-signed my first business loan when no bank would touch me. Jessica had helped me move my stuff out of 3 different apartments when various relationships imploded. They'd seen me at my worst, and maybe that made it hard for them to see me at my best. "I need to go," I told Maya, "but I appreciate the concern," she shrugged. "Just remember, you're not the same person who left Phoenix 8 years ago. Don't let them convince you otherwise." That night, I stood in my walk-in closet, staring at clothes that cost more than I used to make in a month. My lifestyle had changed dramatically over the past few years. The apartment I'd furnished with Target clearance finds had been replaced by a modernist house in the hills with a view of the city. My wardrobe had evolved from department store basics to designer pieces that actually fit properly. But going home always made me second-guess everything. Too casual, and I'd hear about how I'd given up on myself. Too dressed up, and I'd be accused of trying to show off. It was a balancing act I'd never quite mastered. I settled on dark jeans, a silk blouse, and the kind of understated jewelry that whispered rather than shouted. Professional, but not flashy. Put together, but not trying too hard. The flight from Phoenix to Scottsdale was short, but it felt like traveling backward through time. As the plane descended, I could see the sprawling suburbs where I'd grown up, the strip malls and golf courses and swimming pools that defined the landscape of my childhood. From 30,000 feet, it all looked so small. I rented a car at the airport, a sensible sedan, not the Tesla I drove at home, and drove through familiar streets toward my hotel. I'd learned years ago that staying with family was a recipe for disaster. Too much forced intimacy. Too many opportunities for old patterns to resurface. A hotel room gave me a refuge, a place to recharge between family encounters. The hotel was nice but not ostentatious, the kind of place a successful businesswoman might choose without seeming like she was trying to prove anything. I checked in, hung up my dress for tomorrow, and ordered room service. As I sat by the window, picking at a Caesar salad and watching the sun set over the desert, I thought about Maya's words. I wasn't the same person who'd left Phoenix 8 years ago. But somehow, every time I came home, I felt myself shrinking back into that old skin. Tomorrow would be different, I told myself. Tomorrow I would show up as who I really was, not who they expected me to be. But, as I drifted off to sleep that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap I'd helped set for myself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of pristine Arizona sunshine that made everything look like a postcard. I woke up early. Despite the knot of anxiety that had been growing in my stomach since yesterday, the fruit salad Maya had arranged sat in the hotel's mini fridge, perfectly presented in a glass bowl with a ribbon around it. Simple, elegant, and exactly what Jessica had asked for. I spent longer than usual getting ready, blow-drying my hair until it fell in smooth waves past my shoulders, applying makeup with the precision of someone preparing for battle. The navy dress I'd chosen was classic, not too formal, not too casual, expensive enough to look polished, but understated enough not to draw unwanted attention. As I drove through the winding roads leading to Grandview Gardens, memories of previous family gatherings flooded back. There was Dad's 50th, where Jessica had seated me at the overflow table with the neighbors I barely knew, Mom's retirement party, where I'd overheard my aunt telling someone that I was still figuring things out at 32. Christmas dinner 2 years ago, where my cousin Brian had asked if I was still doing that internet thing, while Jessica rolled her eyes. Each memory stung a little less than it used to, but they still had the power to make me feel like I was wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. Grandview Gardens was exactly as I remembered, manicured to perfection, with sprawling lawns, towering palm trees, and the kind of architectural details that screamed, expensive event venue. The parking lot was already half full, and I recognized several cars belonging to family members. Jessica's white SUV with the honor student stickers, Uncle Mike's pickup truck, my parents' sensible sedan. I parked toward the back, taking a moment to check my reflection in the rearview mirror one more time. You belong here, I told myself. You're not the broke 25-year-old who moved back home. You're Rachel Thompson, CEO of Phoenix Rising Media. The pep talk felt hollow, but it was better than nothing. The venue's interior was even more impressive than I'd expected. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the meticulously maintained gardens. The whole place radiated the kind of understated luxury that came with a hefty price tag. I made my way toward the private dining room Jessica had reserved, following the sounds of familiar voices and laughter. As I approached the entrance, I could hear my mother's delighted giggle and my father's booming laugh, the sound of family happiness that I somehow always felt excluded from. "Rachel!" Mom's voice rang out the moment I stepped into the room. She rushed over, her arms outstretched, and pulled me into one of her signature hugs, the kind that lasted just a beat too long and somehow made everything feel better and worse at the same time. "Happy birthday, Mom," I said, handing her a carefully wrapped gift. "You look beautiful." And she did. At 60, Linda Thompson was still stunning, with silver hair styled in soft waves and kind eyes that crinkled when she smiled. She wore an emerald green dress that brought out her eyes and made her look at least 10 years younger. "Oh, honey, you didn't have to," she started, but I cut her off. "Of course I did. It's your birthday." Jessica appeared at Mom's elbow, looking effortlessly put together in a cream-colored wrap dress that probably cost a quarter of what mine did, but somehow looked more expensive. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat chignon, and she wore the kind of subtle makeup that suggested she'd spent 30 minutes making it look like she'd spent 5. "Rachel, you made it," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I wasn't sure you'd be able to get away from work." There it was, the first subtle dig of the evening, wrapped in concern and delivered with a smile. As if my work was some kind of hobby I could abandon whenever convenient. "I wouldn't miss Mom's birthday," I replied smoothly. "Where should I put this?" I held up the fruit salad. "Oh, the food table is over there," Jessica gestured toward a long table set up along one wall. "Though I think we might have enough food already." Aunt Carol brought her famous potato salad, and Mom made her green bean casserole. I set the fruit salad down among the other dishes, noting that mine was the only one in a glass bowl, the only one that looked like it had been professionally arranged. It stood out like a sore thumb among the homemade comfort foods, which was probably exactly what Jessica had intended. "Rachel!" My father's voice boomed across the room. He was standing near the bar with my Uncle Mike and Jessica's husband, David, all 3 of them holding beers, and looking like they'd been deep in conversation about sports or politics, or whatever middle-aged men discussed at family gatherings. I walked over, accepting Dad's bear hug and the kiss on the cheek that followed. Tom Thompson had always been a hugger, the kind of man who expressed affection through physical contact and wasn't afraid to show emotion. He'd cried at my high school graduation, had been more nervous than I was before my first job interview, and had called me every week during my lowest point to make sure I was eating enough. "Look at you," he said, holding me at arm's length. "You look great, kiddo. Successful." "Thanks, Dad. Rachel runs her own business now," he told Mike and David, his chest puffing out with pride. "Something with computers and marketing. Very modern." I winced slightly at the oversimplification, but I'd learned years ago that correcting Dad's version of my career only made him feel bad. To him, I was successful, and that was what mattered. The details were less important than the fact that his younger daughter had figured out how to support herself. "That's great," Mike said, though his tone suggested he had no idea what digital marketing actually entailed. "Must be nice to work from home." "I have an office," I said. "And 12 employees." 12. Dad's eyes widened. "You didn't tell me you had 12 people working for you." "It's been a busy year," I said, which was an understatement. We'd doubled our staff in the past 6 months, and I'd been working 60-hour weeks to keep up with demand. "Well, that's something," David said, though he sounded more polite than impressed. David worked in insurance, had been with the same company for 15 years, and seemed to view entrepreneurship as a risky hobby rather than a legitimate career path. The conversation drifted to safer topics: the weather, the Cardinals' chances this season, whether the city council was right to approve that new development near the freeway. I contributed where I could, but mostly I listened, nursing a glass of wine and trying to shake the feeling that I was an observer rather than a participant in my own family. More relatives arrived throughout the afternoon. Aunt Carol with her husband Jim, my cousin Brian with his wife and 2 kids, various family friends I remembered from childhood. Each arrival brought a round of introductions and explanations, and I found myself reciting the same abbreviated version of my life story over and over. I live in Phoenix now. I run a marketing company, business is good. No one asked for details. No one wanted to hear about the late nights I'd spent learning web design, the years I'd survived on ramen noodles and determination, the moment I'd landed my first major client and realized I might actually make it. They nodded politely and moved on to discussing Jessica's kids, her volunteer work at the school, her latest Pinterest project. It was like being invisible in plain sight. The afternoon wore on with the predictable rhythm of family gatherings, photo sessions with various combinations of relatives, stories about people I barely remembered, updates on neighbors I'd never particularly cared about. I smiled and nodded and contributed when expected, but I felt like I was watching it all from behind glass. Jessica was in her element, of course. She flitted from group to group, making sure everyone had drinks, organizing group photos, updating Mom on the schedule for the evening. She was the perfect hostess, the perfect daughter, the perfect family member who remembered everyone's birthdays and organized the holiday gatherings and never forgot to send thank you notes. "She's really outdone herself," Mom said to me during a quiet moment, nodding toward Jessica as she directed the catering staff. "I don't know how she manages it all." I wanted to point out that Jessica had a stay-at-home lifestyle that allowed her to focus on things like party planning and volunteer work, while I was building a business that required my attention 18 hours a day. But that would have sounded petty, so I just nodded and agreed that Jessica was amazing. Tessiwaitis. Around 4 o'clock, Jessica approached me with a clipboard and a concerned expression. "Rachel, I need to talk to you about seating for dinner." My stomach dropped. "What about it?" "Well, we had to make some adjustments. The kids' table was getting a little crowded, and Emma specifically requested that you sit with them. She's been so excited to see her Aunt Rachel." I stared at her. "You want me to sit at the kids' table?" "It's not really the kids' table," Jessica said quickly. "It's the young people's table. Emma, Marcus, Brian's kids, and you. You'll have so much more fun than sitting with all us boring adults." The words hit me like a physical blow. I was 34 years old, a successful businesswoman, and my sister wanted me to sit at the kids' table because there wasn't room for me with the adults. "Jessica," I said carefully, "I'm not sure that's—" "Please," she interrupted, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "Emma has been talking about it all week. She wants to show you her drawings from art class, and you're so good with kids. You'll be perfect." It wasn't a request. It was a decision that had already been made, presented as if I had a choice in the matter, and it was delivered with just enough emotional manipulation to make me feel selfish if I objected. I looked around the room at my family, at the adults who would be seated at the main table discussing mortgages and school districts and vacation plans, while I sat with a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, pretending to be thrilled about finger paintings and elementary school drama. "Of course," I heard myself say, "whatever works best." Jessica's relief was palpable. "You're the best, Rachel. Really, this is going to be perfect." As she walked away, I felt something inside me shrivel up. 34 years old, and I was still being relegated to the kids' table, still being treated like the family member who didn't quite fit with the grown-ups. I excused myself and headed for the bathroom, needing a moment to collect myself before I said something I'd regret. As I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I saw a successful woman in an expensive dress. But I felt like that lost 25-year-old who'd moved back home with her tail between her legs. What Jessica didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd spent the past 6 months planning something that would change everything. But first, I had to survive dinner at the kids' table. Evening was just getting started, and I had a feeling it was going to be a long night. By 5:30, the party had moved into the main dining room, and I got my first real look at the seating arrangement. The centerpiece was an elegant oval table for 12, adorned with white linens, crystal stemware, and centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath. The lighting was perfect, warm and flattering, the kind that made everyone look like they were starring in their own life movie. Then there was my table. Tucked into a corner near the kitchen doors, a small round table set for 5. Child-sized chairs had been replaced with regular ones, but the colorful paper placemats and crayons scattered across the surface made it unmistakably clear what this was. The kids' table, complete with plastic cups instead of crystal glasses and paper napkins instead of cloth ones. Emma, Jessica's 7-year-old, bounced in her seat when she saw me approaching. Aunt Rachel, look, I saved you the best seat." She patted the chair next to her, which happened to face away from the main table toward the wall. "That's so sweet of you, honey," I managed, settling into the chair and trying to maintain some dignity. Marcus, Jessica's 5-year-old, was already coloring on his placemat with intense concentration, his tongue poking out slightly as he worked. Brian's 8-year-old daughter, Lily, sat across from me, and his 10-year-old son, Jake, slouched in his chair looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "This is stupid," Jake muttered under his breath. "I'm not a little kid." I couldn't help but agree with him, though I kept that thought to myself. From my corner position, I had a perfect view of the adult table, where everyone was settling in with the easy confidence of people who belonged exactly where they were. Jessica sat at Mom's right hand, David beside her. My parents anchored one end of the table, with Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim positioned strategically for optimal conversation flow. The seating arrangement was clearly Jessica's masterwork. Everyone positioned for maximum comfort and engagement. Everyone except me. "Look, Aunt Rachel." Emma thrust a drawing toward me. "I made this for Grandma's birthday. It's our whole family." I studied the crayon drawing, recognizing the stick figures that represented various family members. There was Mom in the center, Dad beside her, Jessica with her characteristic blonde hair, David, the 3 kids. Even Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim had made it into the family portrait. I was nowhere to be found. "It's beautiful, Emma," I said, and I meant it. Kids' art had an honesty that was both refreshing and devastating. "Grandma's going to love it." "I ran out of room," Emma said matter-of-factly, as if that explained my absence. "But you can be on the back if you want." The back of the paper. Even in a 7-year-old's drawing, I was an afterthought. Marcus suddenly looked up from his coloring. "Aunt Rachel, what do you do for work?" It was an innocent question, the kind kids asked when they were trying to understand the adult world. But given the context, it felt loaded with significance. "I run a company," I said. "We help other businesses reach their customers using the internet." Marcus wrinkled his nose. "That sounds boring." "Marcus," Lily scolded him, "that's rude." "It's okay," I said quickly. "Sometimes work can seem boring to kids." But as I watched the main table, where the adults were engaged in animated conversation about local politics and vacation plans, I wondered if that's how my family saw my work too. Boring. Incomprehensible. Not worth discussing. The first course arrived, a delicate butternut squash soup, garnished with roasted pumpkin seeds and a swirl of cream. At the main table, the presentation was flawless. At our table, the server looked harried and slightly annoyed as she set down bowls that were clearly different from what the adults were receiving. "We have a special kids menu tonight," she explained to me apologetically. "Chicken nuggets, mac and cheese, that sort of thing." I stared at her. "I'm 34. She blinked, clearly flustered. "Oh, I'm sorry," I thought, the seating chart said. "Just bring me whatever the adults are having," I said, trying to keep my voice level. Jake snorted. "See? This is why this sucks. They think we're all babies." The server hurried away, and I found myself agreeing with a 10-year-old about the absurdity of my situation. Here I was, a woman who regularly negotiated 6-figure contracts, sitting at a table where the assumption was that I'd want chicken nuggets and chocolate milk. From the main table, I could hear fragments of adult conversation. Jessica was telling everyone about the new art teacher at Emma's school. Dad was sharing a story about his golf game. Mom was laughing at something Uncle Jim had said. They sounded relaxed, engaged, like they were all part of the same exclusive club. "Aunt Rachel?" Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Are you sad?" The question caught me off guard. Kids had a way of cutting through pretense that adults had trained themselves out of. "A little," I admitted. "Is it because you have to sit with us instead of the grown-ups?" I looked into her innocent brown eyes, so much like Jessica's, and felt my heart break a little. This wasn't Emma's fault. None of this was. "I'm not sad about sitting with you," I said, and that was true. Sometimes adults can be complicated. Emma nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense to her. "Mommy says you work too much, and that's why you don't visit." The words hit me like a slap. So that was the narrative Jessica had constructed. Not that I was building something meaningful, not that I was busy because I was successful, but that I was a workaholic who prioritized career over family. "I do work a lot," I said carefully, "but that's because I love what I do." "My mommy doesn't work," Marcus chimed in. "She takes care of us." There it was, the implicit judgment wrapped in childhood innocence. Jessica's choice to be a stay-at-home mom was presented as noble self-sacrifice, while my choice to build a career was selfish ambition. The server returned with my soup, looking embarrassed. "I'm so sorry about the confusion earlier." "It's fine," I said, though it wasn't. As I ate my soup, I listened to the conversation flowing at the main table. They were discussing Jessica's latest volunteer project, organizing a fundraiser for the school library. Everyone was impressed by her dedication, her organizational skills, her commitment to the community. "Jessica's always been the giving one," I heard Mom say. Even as a child, she was always thinking of others. The implication was clear. Jessica was the giving one, which made me, by contrast, the selfish one. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Maya, how's the family torture session going? Do you need an emergency extraction?" I smiled despite myself and typed back, "Surviving. Currently dining with the under 10 demographic." Her response was immediate. "Please tell me you're joking." "Wish I was." "That's insane. You literally employ more people than most of them have ever supervised." She was right, of course, but somehow that logic didn't translate when I was sitting at a table with crayons and paper placemats, listening to my family discuss my sister's volunteer work while my own professional achievements went unmentioned. The main course arrived: herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables for the adults, chicken nuggets and apple slices for the kids' table. I managed to convince the server to bring me the salmon, but the damage to my dignity was already done. "Those look fancy," Lily said, eyeing my vegetables suspiciously. "They're just carrots and broccoli," I said, "cooked differently." "I like chicken nuggets better," Marcus declared, as if this was a fundamental truth about the superiority of processed food over fresh ingredients. From the main table, I could hear Jessica launching into a story about her latest Pinterest project, something involving mason jars and burlap. The adults were listening with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for TED Talks. Every "oh, how clever" and "you're so creative" felt like another reminder of my own perceived inadequacy. My business had been featured in 3 national publications this year. I'd spoken at conferences, mentored other entrepreneurs, built something from nothing. But sitting here, listening to the enthusiastic discussion of DIY centerpieces, I might as well have been unemployed. "Aunt Rachel," Jake said, leaning across the table, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why don't you have kids?" The question hung in the air like a bomb, waiting to explode. It was innocent enough. Kids asked these kinds of direct questions all the time. But in this context, it felt like the universe was conspiring against me. "I've been focused on other things," I said diplomatically. "Like what?" "Building my business, traveling, learning new things." Jake considered this. "My mom says having kids is the most important thing you can do." Of course she did. Jessica had found her identity in motherhood, and like most people who've made a particular life choice, she'd convinced herself it was the only valid path. "Different people find importance in different things," I said. "Your mom is amazing at being a mom. I'm good at other things." "Like what?" Lily asked, genuinely curious. I paused, realizing this was the first time anyone at this gathering had asked me about my actual skills or accomplishments. "I help businesses grow," I said. "I figure out how to connect people with products or services they need. I solve problems." "That sounds cool," Jake said. "Like being a detective." "Kind of, yeah." For the first time all evening, I felt seen, not by the adults who should have been celebrating my achievements, but by a 10-year-old who understood that problem-solving was actually pretty interesting. The conversation at the main table had moved on to vacation plans. Jessica and David were discussing their upcoming trip to Disney World, complete with detailed itineraries and budget breakdowns. Everyone was contributing suggestions and sharing their own Disney experiences. I'd been to 12 countries for business and pleasure. I'd had dinner at Michelin-starred restaurants, stayed in boutique hotels, experienced cultures and cuisines that most people only saw in magazines. But none of that seemed relevant to a conversation about the best fast-pass strategies for Space Mountain. By the time dessert arrived, birthday cake for everyone, with sparkler candles for Mom, I felt emotionally drained. The singing of Happy Birthday felt hollow, my voice lost in the chorus of family members who belonged at this celebration, in ways I apparently didn't. Mom's speech was gracious and warm, thanking everyone for coming, expressing gratitude for her family and friends. She mentioned Jessica's organizational skills, Dad's unwavering support, even Aunt Carol's famous potato salad. She looked in my direction when she talked about being blessed with 2 wonderful daughters, but the words felt perfunctory, a polite inclusion rather than genuine recognition. As the evening wound down and people began gathering their things, I sat at my corner table, surrounded by crayon shavings and crumpled napkins, watching my family laugh and hug and make plans for the next gathering. I felt like an outsider looking in, present in body, but absent in spirit. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this would be the last time they could make me feel this small, because I had information that would change everything, and the time to reveal it was almost here. But first, I had to endure the final humiliation of this carefully orchestrated evening. After the cake was finished and the sparklers had burned out, the evening entered that awkward transition phase where no one was quite sure what came next. The adults lingered at their table, nursing coffee and after-dinner drinks, their conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. Meanwhile, the kids had grown restless, and I found myself in the surreal position of supervising them while the actual parents continued their adult discussions. "Can we go outside?" Emma asked, tugging on my dress. "I want to show Jake the fountain." I glanced toward the main table, where Jessica was deep in conversation with Aunt Carol about some neighborhood drama involving a disputed property line. None of the actual parents seemed concerned about where their children were or what they were doing. "Let me check with your mom," I said, starting to stand. "She's busy," Marcus said matter-of-factly. "She always talks for a long time after dinner." So I became the de facto babysitter, shepherding 4 children through the venue's gardens while their parents enjoyed their adult time. It was the final insult in an evening full of them. Not only was I relegated to the kids' table, but I was also expected to provide childcare services. The gardens were beautiful in the evening light, with strategically placed spotlights illuminating the pathways and water features. Under different circumstances, I might have enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere. Instead, I felt like an unpaid employee at my own mother's birthday party. "Aunt Rachel," Lily said as we walked along a path lined with desert roses, "why do you look sad all the time?" Kids. They had no filter, no social awareness of the questions they weren't supposed to ask. But maybe that's what made them so perceptive. "I'm not sad," I said automatically, then reconsidered. "Well, maybe a little disappointed." "About what?" "How do you explain to an 8-year-old that you feel invisible in your own family? That despite building a successful business and creating jobs for 12 people, you're still treated like the screw-up younger sister who can't be trusted with adult responsibilities?" "Sometimes grown-ups don't understand each other very well," I said finally. Jake, who had been quiet during our walk, suddenly stopped and looked at me seriously. "My dad says you're successful but that you don't act like family anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. So that was the narrative. I was successful but had abandoned my family values in the process. I was the cautionary tale, the daughter who chose career over relationships and somehow lost her way. "Pid, what do you think that means?" I asked, genuinely curious about his interpretation. Jake shrugged. "I don't know, you seem nice to me. And you listen when we talk." Out of the mouths of babes. A 10-year-old could see that I was paying attention, that I was engaged, that I cared about what they were saying. But somehow the adults had decided I was distant and self-absorbed. We made our way back inside just as the venue's general manager, a polished woman in her 50s named Margaret Chen, approached the main table. I recognized her from the business community. We'd met at several networking events over the years. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had built her reputation on flawless execution and attention to detail. "Excuse me," Margaret said to the table, her voice carrying the kind of authority that immediately commanded attention. "I wanted to personally thank you for choosing Grandview Gardens for this special celebration." Jessica beamed, clearly pleased with the recognition. "Oh, it's been perfect. Absolutely perfect." "I'm delighted to hear that," Margaret continued. "Grandview Gardens has been privileged to host the Thompson family tonight, and I wanted to share some exciting news about our venue." The entire table turned their attention to her, including my parents, who looked both curious and slightly confused about why the venue manager was making what appeared to be a formal announcement. Margaret's eyes swept the room until they found me, standing near the entrance with the kids still clustered around me. "Miss Thompson," she said, addressing me directly, "would you like to join the main table for this announcement? I believe it concerns you." Every head in the room turned toward me. Jessica's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching alarm. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, clearly trying to figure out what was happening. "What's going on?" Jessica asked, her voice tight with the kind of control she exercised when situations threatened to spiral beyond her management. Margaret smiled diplomatically. "Perhaps Ms. Rachel Thompson could explain." The room fell silent. Even the kids seemed to sense that something significant was happening, their chatter dying away as they looked back and forth between me and the adults. I walked slowly toward the main table, my heels clicking on the polished floor with each step. Every eye in the room followed my movement, and I could practically hear the gears turning in their heads as they tried to figure out what role I could possibly play in whatever announcement was coming. "Rachel," Mom's voice was tentative, concerned. "What's happening, honey?" I reached the main table and placed my hands on the back of an empty chair, the one that should have been mine from the beginning. Margaret stood beside me, professional and composed, waiting for my lead. This was the moment I'd been planning for months, the conversation I'd rehearsed in my head 100 times. But now that it was here, I found myself hesitating. Once I said the words, there would be no taking them back. The family dynamic would shift permanently, and I wasn't entirely sure I was ready for the consequences. But then I looked at the kids' table in the corner, with its paper placemats and plastic cups, and I remembered the sting of being dismissed, marginalized, treated like a child at my own mother's birthday party. 6 months ago, I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I was approached by a hospitality investment group. They were looking for established venues in the Scottsdale area to add to their portfolio. Jessica's face had gone pale. Dad was leaning forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mom just looked confused. The group was particularly interested in Grandview Gardens because of its reputation and prime location. They made an offer to the previous owners, who accepted. I paused, letting the information sink in. Around the table, family members were beginning to piece together the implications, though none of them had reached the full conclusion yet. "Rachel," Jessica said slowly, "why are you telling us this?" Margaret stepped forward. "Because Ms. Thompson here is one of the principal investors in that hospitality group." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that elegant dining room as my family processed what they'd just learned. "What does that mean exactly?" Dad asked, his voice careful and measured. Margaret looked at me, giving me the opportunity to deliver the news myself. I straightened my shoulders and looked around the table at the faces of people who had spent the evening treating me like I didn't belong. "It means," I said clearly, "that I own this place." The words hung in the air like smoke from the birthday candles. Jessica's mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out. Uncle Mike nearly choked on his coffee. Aunt Carol's hand flew to her chest as if she needed to physically hold her heart in place. "Ekma." Mom was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "You own Grandview Gardens?" "Not entirely," I clarified. "I'm part of an investment consortium that purchased the venue. But yes, I'm one of the owners." The family stared at me as if I'd just announced I was moving to Mars. Jessica, in particular, looked like she'd seen a ghost. Specifically, the ghost of her perfectly controlled evening. "But how?" she stammered. "When? Why didn't you tell us?" You never asked about my business, I said simply. You knew I ran a marketing company, but you never wanted details. This is one of the details. Margaret cleared her throat diplomatically. Ms. Thompson's company specializes in digital marketing for hospitality and event venues. When the investment group was putting together their portfolio, her expertise in the industry made her an obvious choice as both a consultant and an investor. David, Jessica's husband, was doing mental calculations. But this place must have cost several $1,000,000, I finished. Yes. The number seemed to hit them like a physical force. I watched as they recalibrated everything they thought they knew about my life, my success, my place in the family hierarchy. Rachel, Mom said, tears starting to form in her eyes. I had no idea. Why didn't you tell me you were doing so well? It was a fair question, but the answer was complicated. How do you explain that you stopped sharing good news because it was either dismissed or turned into a lecture about values and priorities? How do you tell your mother that you'd learned to downplay your success because celebrating it made other people uncomfortable? I tried, I said gently. But it seemed like every time I talked about work, the conversation changed to something else. Jessica found her voice, though it came out strained. So when I called to book this venue for Mom's party, the reservation went through our normal booking system, I said. I didn't know you'd chosen this place until Margaret mentioned it to me a few weeks ago. That was a slight simplification of the truth. I'd actually known about the booking for months and had specifically requested that Margaret not mention my involvement. I'd wanted to see how the evening would unfold naturally, wanted to understand once and for all where I stood in my family's eyes. Now I knew. Proer. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of kitchen staff cleaning up. My family sat frozen, processing the revelation that the daughter they'd relegated to the kids' table was actually successful enough to own the venue they were sitting in. Margaret, sensing the need for a graceful exit, stepped forward. I'll leave you all to process this news. Miss Thompson, thank you again for choosing to invest in Grandview Gardens. Your vision for preserving the venue's elegance while modernizing its operations has been invaluable. She walked away, leaving us alone with the weight of everything that had been revealed and everything that still needed to be said. Dad was the first to break the silence. Jesus, Rachel, you bought a restaurant. It's an event venue, I corrected, and I'm part of an ownership group. We have 4 properties now. 4 properties. Each word seemed to land with increasing impact as they realized the scope of what I'd built while they thought I was playing around with computers. The evening had taken a turn none of us had expected, least of all me. I'd planned to reveal my ownership at some point, but I'd imagined it happening differently, maybe in private conversation with my parents, or as a casual mention over coffee. Instead, it had become the climactic moment of an evening that had systematically demonstrated just how little my family understood about who I'd become. The kids' table suddenly seemed like a symbol of something much larger, their inability to see me as anything other than the struggling young woman I'd been a decade ago. But now the truth was out, and everything had to change. The silence that followed my revelation stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I could practically see the gears turning in everyone's heads as they tried to reconcile the woman they'd just seated at the kids' table with someone who had the financial capacity to own a multi-million-dollar venue. Jessica was the first to recover, though her composure was clearly strained. So you've known all along that we booked Mom's party here? She asked, her voice carrying an edge I'd rarely heard from her. For about 3 months, I admitted. Margaret mentioned it during one of our investor meetings. And you didn't think to tell us? The accusation in her tone was unmistakable. I looked around the table at my family's faces. Confusion, embarrassment, and in Jessica's case, something that looked suspiciously like anger. Tell you what, exactly? That I own part of the venue where you chose to hold Mom's party? Would that have changed anything? The question hung in the air, because we all knew the answer. It wouldn't have changed Jessica's perception of me as the irresponsible younger sister. It wouldn't have earned me a seat at the adult table. If anything, they probably would have accused me of showing off or trying to upstage Mom's birthday. Dad cleared his throat, his businessman instincts kicking in despite the family drama. Rachel, help me understand something. How does someone go from running a small marketing company to owning event venues? It was a fair question, and one that deserved a real answer rather than the oversimplified version I usually gave at family gatherings. It started about 3 years ago, I began, settling into the chair I'd claimed at the main table. One of my clients was a boutique hotel chain. I was handling their digital marketing, and I started noticing patterns in their booking data that they weren't seeing. Uncle Mike leaned forward, genuinely interested despite his earlier dismissiveness. What kind of patterns? Seasonal trends, demographic shifts, untapped market segments. I developed a comprehensive analysis and strategy that increased their revenue by 40% in the first year. Mom's eyes widened. 40%? The hotel owners were so impressed that they offered me a consulting contract with equity participation. That led to other opportunities in the hospitality industry. When the investment group formed to acquire premium venues, they wanted someone who understood both the marketing side and the operational challenges. I paused, watching their faces as they processed this information. Phoenix Rising Media isn't just a marketing company anymore. We're a full-service hospitality consultancy with clients across the Southwest. Brian, my cousin who had barely acknowledged me earlier, spoke up. How many properties do you own now? 4 venues, with 2 more in the acquisition pipeline. Plus, I have consulting contracts with 15 other properties. The numbers seemed to hit them like successive waves. Each revelation forced them to adjust their understanding of who I was and what I'd accomplished, while they thought I was struggling to make ends meet with a small computer business. Aunt Carol, who had spent the earlier part of the evening discussing Jessica's volunteer work like it was a Nobel Prize-worthy achievement, looked genuinely stunned. Rachel, honey, I had no idea you were doing so well. I tried to tell you, I said, not unkindly. At Dad's retirement party, I mentioned that business was expanding. At Christmas dinner, I talked about opening a new office. But every time I brought up work, the conversation shifted to other things. Jessica's face had gone through several color changes during this conversation, settling finally on a pale shade that matched her cream dress. So when you said you were busy with work, I was managing a multi-million-dollar business expansion while consulting on hospitality acquisitions and overseeing 12 employees across 3 states, I finished. Yes, I was busy. The weight of their previous dismissals seemed to settle on the table like dust. Every eye roll when I mentioned working late, every comment about how I needed to find balance, every suggestion that I was using work as an excuse to avoid family. All of it took on a different meaning now. Dad was shaking his head slowly. Jesus, kiddo, you're running a real empire and we thought you were playing around on computers, I finished with a wry smile. I know. But why didn't you tell us how big it had gotten? Mom asked, her voice thick with emotion. We're your family. We should know these things. It was the question I'd been dreading because the answer was going to hurt. But after spending the evening at the kids' table watching my professional achievements get dismissed while Jessica's Pinterest projects received enthusiastic praise, I was done protecting everyone's feelings. Because every time I tried to share good news, it got minimized or turned into a lecture about priorities. I said gently but firmly. When I told you I was featured in Forbes, Dad, you said I should be careful not to let success go to my head. When I mentioned speaking at a conference, Mom, you asked if I was sure I wasn't taking on too much. When I said I was considering expansion, Jessica told me that growing too fast was how businesses fail. The specific examples landed with visible impact. I watched recognition dawn on their faces as they remembered conversations they'd probably forgotten, but that had shaped my decision to stop sharing. We were trying to protect you, Jessica said defensively. You'd been through so much already, we didn't want you to get hurt again. Protect me from what? Success? Achievement? Building something meaningful? From overextending yourself, she shot back. From repeating the same patterns that got you into trouble before. There it was. The fundamental assumption that had colored every interaction we'd had for years. In their minds, I was still the 25-year-old who'd moved back home broke and defeated. Despite years of evidence to the contrary, they couldn't see past that old version of me. Jessica, I said quietly, That was almost 10 years ago. I've learned a few things since then. Have you? The question came out sharper than she probably intended. Because from where I sit, it looks like you've learned to build walls. You live in a different city, you rarely visit, you don't share important news. How is that different from running away? The accusation stung because there was truth in it, but not the truth she thought she was revealing. I didn't run away, I said. I built something, and every time I tried to share it with you, I was made to feel like I was bragging or neglecting what really mattered. What really matters? Jessica's voice was rising now, her careful composure finally cracking. Family matters, Rachel. Being present matters. Not everything is about money and business success. You're right, I agreed. Not everything is about business success. But tonight, you seated me at the kids' table because you decided I wasn't accomplished enough or mature enough to sit with the adults. So apparently, to you, some kind of success does matter. It's just not the kind I have. The words landed like a slap. Jessica's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Around the table, the rest of the family shifted uncomfortably, as the underlying dynamics that had shaped the evening finally came into the open. Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Rachel, sweetheart, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Has there? I asked. Because from where I was sitting, literally, it seemed pretty clear. Jessica organized this beautiful celebration for your birthday. She made sure everyone had the perfect seat, the right meal, the ideal conversation partners. Everyone, except me. That's not what I meant to do, Jessica said quickly, but her protest lacked conviction. Maybe not consciously, I said. But subconsciously, I think you still see me as the screw-up little sister who needs to be managed and contained. The one who might embarrass the family if she's given too much freedom or attention. Tears were starting to form in Jessica's eyes, though whether from anger or hurt or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. That's not fair. Isn't it? Tell me, Jessica, if you'd known I was one of the owners of this venue, would you have put me at the kids' table? She didn't answer, which was answer enough. David, who had been silent through most of this exchange, finally spoke up. Rachel, I think you're being a little harsh. Jessica worked really hard to make tonight special for your mom. I'm not questioning her effort, I said. I'm questioning her assumptions about me and my place in this family. Uncle Mike, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, tried to lighten the mood. Well, this is certainly more excitement than we usually get at family dinners. But the moment for deflection had passed. The truth was out now, in all its uncomfortable complexity. We couldn't go back to pretending that nothing had happened, that the seating arrangement was innocent, that my years of professional growth had been acknowledged and celebrated. Mom was crying now, quiet tears that she was trying to hide behind her napkin. I'm so sorry, honey, she whispered. I'm so proud of you, and I'm sorry if we haven't shown it. Mom, it's okay, I started, but she shook her head. No, it's not okay. You've accomplished incredible things, and instead of celebrating with you, we've made you feel like you had to hide your success. That's on us, not you. The validation I'd been craving for years was finally coming, but it felt hollow somehow. Too little, too late, prompted only by the dramatic revelation that I had more money and power than they'd realized. The kids, who had been remarkably quiet during this adult drama, were starting to get restless. Emma tugged on Jessica's sleeve. Mommy, why is everyone crying? Jessica wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. Grown-up stuff, sweetheart, nothing for you to worry about. But I looked at Emma's concerned face and realized that the kids had been the most authentic part of my evening. They'd asked real questions, listened to my answers, treated me like a person rather than a disappointing family obligation. You know what, Emma? I said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. Sometimes grown-ups need to have important conversations. That's all this is. She nodded solemnly, satisfied with an honest answer in a way that adults rarely were. The evening was far from over, and there were still difficult conversations ahead. But for the first time in years, the truth was on the table between us. Messy and uncomfortable, but finally, completely real. The weight of unspoken truths hung heavy in the dining room as my family struggled to process not just what I'd revealed, but what it meant about the assumptions they'd been carrying for years. Jessica had gone quiet, staring at her hands while the kids fidgeted in their chairs, sensing the adult tension even if they couldn't understand it. Dad broke the silence, his voice careful and measured. "Rachel, I need to ask you something and I want an honest answer." I nodded, bracing myself. "Are you angry with us? Have you been angry this whole time?" The question caught me off guard because it cut straight to the heart of emotions I'd been trying to manage all evening. Was I angry? Or was it something deeper and more complicated than that? "I'm not angry," I said slowly, searching for the right words. "I'm disappointed and tired." "Tired of what?" Mom asked, her voice still thick with tears. "Tired of feeling invisible. Tired of having my accomplishments dismissed or minimized. Tired of being treated like I'm still that broke 25-year-old who moved back home." I looked around the table at faces I'd known my entire life. People who loved me, I knew, but who had somehow lost the ability to see me clearly. "Do you know what it's like," I continued, "to work 18-hour days building something meaningful, something that employs people and creates value, only to come home and have it referred to as, quote, playing on computers? Do you know what it's like to be featured in national publications and have your own family act like it's a hobby that's gotten out of hand?" Uncle Jim, who had been unusually quiet, shifted in his seat. "We didn't mean to make you feel that way." "I know you didn't," I said. "But intention and impact aren't the same thing." Jessica finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "So this is all our fault? We're the villains because we cared about you and wanted you to be happy? That's not what I'm saying. Because from where I sit," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "it looks like you built this successful business and then decided you were too good for your family. When was the last time you visited just because? When was the last time you called to check in without it being a birthday or holiday obligation?" The accusation hit its mark, because there was truth in it. I had pulled back from family gatherings, had found excuses to avoid visits, had let my resentment create distance between us. "You want the truth?" I asked. "The last time I tried to visit just because was 2 years ago. I flew in for a long weekend, thinking we could spend some quality time together. Remember what happened?" Jessica's expression flickered with uncertainty. "You spent the entire weekend trying to set me up with your neighbor's divorced brother, because you thought I needed someone to settle me down. When I tried to show you photos from the conference where I'd spoken, you changed the subject to ask if I'd considered freezing my eggs. When I mentioned that I was thinking about buying a house, you suggested I might want to wait until I found a husband to help with the mortgage." The specific memories seemed to land with physical force. I watched Jessica's face as she remembered conversations that had clearly meant something different to her than they had to me. "I was trying to be supportive," she said weakly. "You were trying to fix a life that you'd decided was broken." I corrected. "You couldn't celebrate my success because you were too busy worrying that I wasn't following the same path you chose." Mom reached across the table again, this time taking both of our hands. "Girls, please. This is supposed to be a celebration." "Is it?" I asked gently. "Because I've spent most of this evening feeling like I was being tolerated rather than celebrated. Like I was a problem to be managed rather than a daughter to be welcomed." The words hung in the air as the full scope of the evening's dynamics became clear to everyone. The kids' table wasn't just about seating arrangements. It was a physical manifestation of how my family saw my place in their lives. David, who had been watching this exchange with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. "Look, maybe we all need to take a step back here. This is getting pretty heated." "Maybe it needs to get heated," I said. "Maybe we've been politely avoiding these conversations for too long." Aunt Carol, clearly wanting to diffuse the tension, tried to redirect. "Rachel, honey, can you tell us more about your business? I'd love to understand what you do." It was a peace offering, an attempt to show interest, after years of dismissal. But it felt performative, prompted by the revelation of my wealth, rather than genuine curiosity about my work. "I appreciate the question, Aunt Carol, but I've tried to explain my work at family gatherings before. Tonight was the first time anyone seemed interested in listening." The truth of that statement was written on their faces. They all remembered conversations where they'd nodded politely while I talked about clients and contracts, then quickly steered the discussion back to more familiar territory. Emma, who had been remarkably patient during this adult drama, suddenly piped up. "Aunt Rachel, are you rich?" The innocent question broke through the tension like a knife through butter. Several adults actually laughed despite themselves. "Emma," Jessica scolded, but I held up a hand. "It's okay, she's asking an honest question." I turned to my niece. "I have enough money to take care of myself and help other people, which I guess some people might call rich." "Cool," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Can you buy me a pony?" "Emma!" This time it was Mom who protested, but she was smiling through her tears. "We'll talk about ponies later," I said, winking at her. But the moment of levity couldn't completely dispel the heaviness that had settled over the table. We were all processing years of miscommunication and misunderstanding, and it wasn't going to be resolved in one evening. Brian, who had been mostly silent through the family drama, cleared his throat. "Rachel, I owe you an apology. I've been dismissive of your work, and that wasn't fair. I guess I didn't understand the scope of what you were doing." The admission was unexpected and generous. "Thank you, Brian. That means a lot. But I have to ask," he continued, "why keep it secret? Why not just tell us how successful you'd become?" It was the question I'd been dreading because the answer revealed something uncomfortable about all of us. Because every time I shared good news, it was either dismissed or turned into a lecture about balance and priorities. Because success made everyone uncomfortable. Because it was easier to let you think I was struggling than to deal with the judgment that came with achievement. I paused, choosing my words carefully. And because honestly, I wasn't sure you'd be happy for me. I was afraid you'd find ways to minimize it or explain why it didn't really count. The admission hung heavy in the air. It revealed not just my own insecurities, but their patterns of response that had created those insecurities. Jessica was crying openly now, no longer trying to hide it. "God, Rachel, is that really what you think of us?" "It's what I've experienced," I said softly, maybe not intentionally but consistently. Dad, who had been processing everything in his methodical way, suddenly straightened up. "You know what? This is bullshit." Everyone turned to stare at him. Dad rarely swore, especially not at family gatherings. "Not you, Rachel," he clarified quickly. "This whole situation. My daughter, my brilliant, successful daughter, has been hiding her achievements because we made her feel like she couldn't share them. That's on us." He looked around the table with an expression I'd rarely seen from him. Disappointment in his family, including himself. "We've been so worried about Rachel getting hurt again that we forgot to notice she'd already succeeded. We've been so focused on the daughter we thought we lost that we missed the woman she became." The words hit me harder than I'd expected. This was the validation I'd been craving for years, but hearing it now, in this context, made me realize how much energy I'd wasted trying to earn something that should have been freely given. "Tom's right," Mom said, her voice steady despite her tears. "We failed you, honey. We were so caught up in our own fears and assumptions that we couldn't see what was right in front of us." Uncle Mike nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about trying to tell us things. I remember now. You did try, we just weren't listening." The acknowledgement was validating, but it also highlighted the years of frustration and loneliness that had built up while I waited for them to notice who I'd become. Margaret Chen appeared at the edge of our conversation, having given us privacy during the family drama. "Excuse me," she said diplomatically, "but I wanted to let you know that the evening service will be ending soon. Is there anything else you need?" The question forced us to confront the fact that this conversation, as necessary as it was, couldn't resolve years of misunderstanding in a single evening. "Actually," I said, standing up, "there is something else." I looked around the table at my family. Flawed, loving, complicated people who had hurt me without meaning to, and who were now struggling to understand how to move forward. "I'd like to invite everyone to stay for a while longer. The venue is ours for the evening, and I think we have more to talk about." Jessica looked up at me, her mascara smudged but her eyes clearer than they'd been all evening. "Are you sure? After everything?" "Especially after everything," I said. "We've spent too many years not talking about the things that matter. Maybe it's time to change that." The real conversation, I realized, was just beginning. After Margaret left us alone again, the room felt different. Heavier with possibility, but also more fragile. Everyone seemed to understand that we were at a crossroads, that the conversations happening now would determine whether this evening became a turning point or just another family fight that we'd politely ignore until the next gathering. "Before we go any further," I said, settling back into my chair, "I need to have a private conversation with Jessica." The words sent a visible ripple through the table. Mom's eyes darted between us, clearly worried about what might be said without witnesses. Dad looked like he wanted to object, probably afraid that Jessica and I would tear each other apart without family mediation. "That's probably a good idea," Jessica said quietly, though her voice carried uncertainty. "The kids are getting restless anyway," David said, clearly relieved to have an excuse to escape the emotional intensity. "Maybe we should take them outside for a bit, let them run around the gardens." Within minutes, the dining room had cleared except for Jessica and me, sitting across from each other at a table that had witnessed years of unspoken resentments finally coming to light. The candles had burned lower, casting flickering shadows across our faces. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Jessica fidgeted with her napkin, avoiding eye contact, while I tried to figure out where to begin a conversation that was years overdue. "I need you to understand something," I said finally. "Tonight wasn't about humiliating you or making a scene at Mom's birthday. I never intended for it to play out this way." "Then why didn't you tell me?" The question came out raw, wounded. "When I called to book this place, why didn't you mention that you owned it?" "Because I wanted to see how you'd treat me without knowing. I wanted to understand, once and for all, where I actually stood in this family." Jessica's face crumpled slightly. "And where do you think you stand?" "Until tonight? Like the family charity case. The sister who needed to be managed and contained because she might do something embarrassing if left to her own devices." The words hung between us, brutal in their honesty. Jessica stared at her hands, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were swimming with tears. "Is that really how you see yourself? How you think we see you? Jessica, you put me at the kids' table at Mom's 60th birthday party, at a venue I own. How else am I supposed to interpret that?" "I thought you'd have more fun there," she said weakly, but even she seemed to realize how inadequate that explanation was. "Did you? Or did you think I didn't belong with the adults?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Jessica pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to hold back tears that were coming anyway. "I don't know," she whispered. "Maybe both. Maybe I've been so used to thinking of you as little sister Rachel, the one who needed protecting, that I couldn't see past it." It was the first real admission she'd made all evening, and it cost her something to say it. "But you have to understand," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Every time you succeeded at something, it felt like you were pulling further away from us. Every promotion, every achievement, every time you chose work over family events, it reinforced the idea that we weren't important to you anymore." "That's not true, isn't it?" Jessica interrupted. "When was the last time you called me just to talk? Not for birthdays or holidays or family obligations, but just because you wanted to hear my voice?" The question hit harder than I'd expected, because I couldn't remember. In my focus on building my business and proving my worth, I had pulled back from casual family connections. "When was the last time you asked about my life without making it clear that you thought my choices were small and unimportant?" I countered. Jessica flinched. "I never said your choices were unimportant." "You didn't have to say it. Every time I talked about work, you changed the subject. Every time I mentioned an achievement, you followed it with concerns about work-life balance. Every time I seemed excited about something professional, you found a way to redirect the conversation to when I was going to settle down and have kids. Because I want you to be happy." The words burst out of her with surprising force. "Because I look at your life, successful, independent, impressive, and I worry that you're missing out on the things that make life meaningful." "Like what?" "Like family, like community, like being part of something bigger than your career." I stared at her, realizing that we'd been having completely different conversations for years. "Jessica, my work is about being part of something bigger. I employ 12 people who depend on me for their livelihoods. I help small businesses grow and succeed. I'm building something that matters." "But you're doing it alone," she said softly. "No husband, no kids, no roots in a community. Don't you ever get lonely?" The question revealed so much about how she saw my life. Successful, but hollow. Impressive, but ultimately empty. It also revealed her deepest fear about the path I'd chosen. Of course I get lonely sometimes, I admitted. But I also get fulfilled. I get excited about problems I'm solving, and deals I'm closing, and people I'm helping. I get satisfaction from building something with my own hands and mind. But what happens when you're older? When work isn't enough anymore? What happens when your kids grow up and move away? When your identity as a mother becomes less central to your daily life? What happens when David retires, and you're both sitting around wondering what to do with yourselves? The questions clearly stung, but they needed to be asked. We'd both made choices, and both sets of choices came with trade-offs. At least I'll have built relationships, Jessica said defensively. At least I'll have invested in people instead of just businesses. You think I don't invest in people? Jessica, my assistant Maya grew up in foster care. I've mentored her, helped her go back to school, given her opportunities she never would have had otherwise. My head of operations, Carlos, was unemployed for 8 months before I hired him. I've built a company culture where people feel valued and supported. I leaned forward, willing her to understand. The idea that career success and caring about people are mutually exclusive is a false choice. I didn't choose business over relationships. I chose to build relationships through business. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd said. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. I think I've been jealous, she admitted. The confession hung in the air between us, vulnerable and honest. Jealous of what? Of your freedom, your success, your ability to make choices based on what you want instead of what everyone else needs. She wiped her eyes with her napkin. Do you know what it's like to introduce yourself as Emma and Marcus's mom instead of having your own identity? I softened, hearing the pain in her voice. No, I don't. But do you know what it's like to have your family treat your identity as selfish and somehow inadequate? I didn't mean to do that. I know you didn't. But impact and intention aren't the same thing. We sat in silence for a moment, both processing the honesty we'd finally shared with each other. The kids' table thing, Jessica said eventually, it wasn't just about seating. It was about control, I think. About keeping you in a role where I understood who you were and where you fit. And where did you think I fit? As my little sister who needed looking after. Even when the evidence clearly showed that you'd outgrown needing anyone to look after you. It was the acknowledgement I'd been waiting years to hear, but now that it was here, it felt bittersweet rather than triumphant. I don't need looking after, I said gently, but I do need to be seen, really seen, for who I am now, not who I used to be. I'm trying, Jessica said. Tonight has been eye-opening. But, Rachel, you have to meet me halfway. You can't just disappear from our lives and then get angry when we don't know how to connect with you. She was right, and I knew it. My withdrawal from family life had been both a response to feeling unwelcome and a contribution to the problem. You're right, I admitted. I have pulled away. But every time I tried to engage, I felt like I was being judged or managed or corrected. It became easier to just not try. So what do we do now? She asked. How do we fix this? It was a good question, and one that didn't have simple answers. Years of miscommunication and hurt feelings couldn't be resolved in a single conversation, no matter how honest. I think we start by accepting that we've both made mistakes, I said, and we commit to doing better going forward. What does that look like? It looks like you stopping trying to fix my life and me stopping withdrawing from yours. It looks like having real conversations about our actual experiences instead of making assumptions about what the other person needs or wants. Jessica nodded slowly. And it looks like me trusting that you're capable of making good decisions for yourself, even if they're different from the decisions I would make. And me trusting that your concern comes from love, even when it feels like judgment. We looked at each other across the table, two sisters who had somehow lost the ability to see each other clearly but were finally beginning to find their way back. For what it's worth, Jessica said quietly, I am proud of you. I've always been proud of you. I just didn't know how to show it without sounding like I was trying to take credit or make it about me somehow. And for what it's worth, I think you're an amazing mother and community member. I've never thought your choices were small or unimportant. I just wanted mine to be seen as valid too. The acknowledgement felt like a weight lifting off both of us. We weren't fixed. There was still work to do, trust to rebuild, new patterns to establish. But for the first time in years, we were actually talking to each other instead of past each other. "Should we go get the others?" Jessica asked. "Let them know we didn't kill each other?" I laughed, feeling lighter than I had all evening. "Yeah, I think Mom's probably convinced we're having a knife fight in here." As we stood to leave the dining room, Jessica caught my arm. "Rachel, thank you for staying, for talking, for giving us a chance to do better." "Thank you for being willing to hear it," I replied. We walked toward the garden doors together, two sisters who had finally begun the hard work of actually knowing each other again. When Jessica and I emerged from the dining room, we found our family scattered across the garden terrace, the kids running around the fountain while the adults sat in small clusters, clearly trying to process everything that had unfolded. The desert evening had settled into that perfect Arizona temperature, where the air felt like silk against your skin. Mom spotted us first, her face immediately scanning our expressions for signs of damage. When she saw us walking together, talking quietly, relief washed over her features. "Everything okay?" Dad asked as we approached, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "We're working on it," I said, settling into one of the wrought iron chairs arranged around a low table. "But I think we understand each other better now." Jessica sat beside me, not across from me, which felt significant somehow. "We both have some things to work on," she added. The simple admission seemed to unlock something in the rest of the family. Uncle Mike visibly relaxed, and Aunt Carol's worried expression softened. Even David looked less like he was preparing for an emergency family mediation. "Good," Mom said simply, "because life's too short for sisters not to talk to each other." Emma came running over, her dress grass-stained and her hair escaping from its carefully styled ponytail. "Aunt Rachel! Mommy! Come see the fishies in the fountain!" The pure joy in her voice was exactly what we all needed. Without discussing it, the entire family gravitated toward the fountain, where goldfish swam lazily in the illuminated water. For a few minutes we just stood there watching the kids point excitedly at the fish, and it felt almost normal. "Aunt Rachel," Marcus said, tugging on my dress, "now that you own this place, can we have my birthday party here?" "Marcus," Jessica protested, but she was smiling now. "We can definitely talk about it," I said, winking at him, "though you'll have to check with your mom about dates." The casual way I'd said it, acknowledging both my ownership and Jessica's parental authority, seemed to register with everyone. It was such a small thing, but it represented the balance we'd need to find going forward. As the evening wound down, Margaret appeared one final time to ensure everything was to our satisfaction. "Ms. Thompson," she said to me, "I wanted to thank you again for choosing Grandview Gardens. It's been an honor hosting your family tonight." "Actually," I said, glancing at my family gathered around the fountain, "I'd like to discuss making this a regular arrangement. Perhaps we could reserve the same dining room for family celebrations going forward?" Mom's hand flew to her heart. "Rachel, you don't need to." "I want to," I interrupted gently. "All those years I felt like I didn't have a place at the family table. Well, now I can make sure we always have the perfect table for everyone." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Instead of letting the evening's painful revelations drive us apart, I was literally investing in bringing us together. Dad cleared his throat, emotion thick in his voice. That's really something, kiddo." "But only if everyone wants that," I added quickly. "This can't be about me trying to buy my way back into the family. It has to be about all of us choosing to do better." Jessica reached over and squeezed my hand. "We want that," she said firmly. "And not because of what you can provide, but because you're family. You've always been family, even when we forgot how to show it." As we gathered our things and prepared to leave, I realized that everything had changed, and nothing had changed. I was still the daughter who'd left home to build something bigger than what her hometown offered. Jessica was still the sister who'd stayed close to care for family and community. Our parents were still the same loving but sometimes clueless people who'd raised us. But the story we told ourselves about those roles, about who mattered and who belonged and who got to sit where, that had shifted fundamentally. 3 months later, I stood in the same dining room at Grandview Gardens, but this time the occasion was Marcus's 6th birthday party. The kids' table was still there, filled with Marcus's friends from school, but I was seated at the main table with the other adults, contributing to conversations about everything from local politics to vacation planning to Marcus's obsession with dinosaurs. When the birthday boy requested that his Aunt Rachel give a toast, I stood up and looked around the table at my family. Complicated, loving, imperfect people who were learning, as I was learning, how to see each other clearly. To Marcus, I said, raising my glass, who reminds us that growing up doesn't mean we have to stop discovering new things. And to family, which isn't about where you sit, but about who shows up. The toast was met with genuine applause, and as I sat back down, Jessica leaned over and whispered, "Much better than chicken nuggets in plastic cups." I laughed, remembering that awful evening that had somehow led us here. Much better, I agreed. Mom's birthday party had ended with me feeling like I'd finally found my place at the family table. But the real victory wasn't in claiming that seat. It was in helping create a table where everyone could belong as themselves, without pretense or apology. That night, as I drove back to Phoenix, I called Maya to check in on a client presentation happening the next day. But I also found myself thinking about Christmas dinner, about Easter brunch, about all the family gatherings to come where I wouldn't have to choose between hiding my success and feeling guilty about it. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to going home. The kids' table had taught me something valuable after all. Sometimes you have to sit in the wrong place to understand where you really belong. And sometimes the people who love you most need to see you succeed on your own terms before they can celebrate that success with you. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Thanks again for hosting tonight. Emma's already planning her birthday party menu." I smiled and typed back, "Tell her we can do whatever she wants. That's what family tables are for." The highway stretched ahead of me, leading back to my real life. The business I'd built, the team I'd assembled, the future I was creating one decision at a time. But for the first time in years, that future included regular seats at a family table where everyone belonged exactly as they were. And that felt like the biggest success of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.